I've been concerned, but not worried, over the looming trade war between the U.S. and China. I've not worried because tariffs don't work. They are blunt instruments in a globalized economy, penalizing American companies and consumers as much as Chinese. Most American experts oppose tariffs, and President Donald Trump likes to make big deals after making big threats. But I am worried over a looming tech war, because competition and conflict go deeper, and worried over the sharp division among Trump's economic team, with the China hawks appealing to Trump's instincts that, as he put it recently, China has become very spoiled. Moreover, the U.S. 2017 National Security Strategy alleges multiple threats that China poses to American influence and values, including military expansion, predatory mercantilism, social repression, and human rights. China asserts that U.S. measures threatening China's economic interests and security will be met with countermeasures. This week, Vice Premier Liu He, President Xi Jinping's special envoy, led a high-powered delegation of senior officials to Washington prepared to do business. Negotiations ended well. Liu He said there will be no trade war. Both sides will stop imposing protective tariffs on each other. U.S. Secretary of Treasury Steven Mnuchin said the two sides agreed to put a possible trade war on hold. One wants to be optimistic, but one would be forgiven for seeing some daylight between the two statements. The devil, no doubt, will be in the details, and in the U.S., other voices are murmuring. What signs should we look for to be closer to China? World markets sighed with relief as the U.S. and China both reported meaningful progress and agreed to stop imposing tariffs, according to China, and to put tariffs on hold, according to the U.S. At least they agreed on no tariffs, at least for the moment. The two sides constructed a framework, which they will now seek to execute with continuing talks in Beijing. To make it work, they have to find overlap between the minimum changes the U.S. will demand and the maximum changes China can accept in 4 areas: trade deficit, how much is a substantial reduction; market access in China; intellectual property rights protection; China's subsidies for technology companies. Hardliners in both countries criticize the interim agreement. Uncertainty remains as President Donald Trump sends mixed messages. When Trump earlier tweeted that he and China's President Xi Jinping would always be friends no matter what happens with our dispute on trade, observers could not decide whether that was good news or bad news. With us in Chengdu, we have William Zaret, Chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. In our Beijing studio is Li Wei, Director of the Institute of American and Oceanic Studies at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Li Yong, former Vice President of China Association of International Trade. Welcome, gentlemen. What do we make of the statement, the joint statement between the United States and China? Is it something that we should be celebrating to see that there is no trade war? Vice Premier Liu He said that there's be no imposition of tariffs and no trade war, yet U.S. Secretary of Treasury Steven Mnuchin said that the trade war and tariffs are on hold. Is there a significant difference between the two statements?
You know, from the perspective of Vice Premier Liu He, I think that's the ultimate purpose. And while, you know, from the perspective of the U.S. side, probably the U.S. side still wants to hold the trigger for the first shot.
I've been following the continuing news out of Washington, and it seems to be kind of a tidal wave of criticism of Donald Trump for being too soft on China after he was so tough during his campaign. There's a big difference between his bark and his bite. People put the ratio in the tens of thousands to 1. What do you think about that?
The fact that Secretary Mnuchin says, okay, this is temporary, we'll see what happens as we go forward, I think should address what the critics, at least what some of the critics are saying. Frankly, if Mnuchin didn't have if he hadn't said that, if we didn't have the possibility of applying tariffs or other pressures on China as we go forward, then I would say that this agreement is basically not substantive.
From the standpoint of the Chinese intellectual community that is involved in trade and economics, what is the inner feelings now in terms of this agreement?
There might be some difference in the expressions from the two sides, but in my opinion, the most important thing is that we have eased the tension, eased the trade conflict escalation. I think that's the most important thing. Secondly, I want to say we have achieved a kind of a balanced compromise between the two countries. It will benefit both China and the United States.
The big specific, if there is one, is the agreement for China to purchase significant, whatever that word means, quantities of agricultural and farming products and also energy. Those are non-manufactured goods, non-technology. The companies that you represent, I think close to 1,000 American companies in China, does that make them happy?
In terms of China buying more agricultural goods, more energy products, a lot of our companies are not going to necessarily benefit from that. A lot of our companies basically produce for the China market or for third world markets. But again, I think the overall feeling here is positive. At least they're sighing a breath of relief that, at least for a while, we're not going to have tariffs.
Let me list what I think are the major categories, and you guys can amplify it or comment. First is obviously the trade deficit. That is what President Trump has focused on. That's a very complicated thing. He approaches it rather simply, but we can deal with that. Second is open access to markets in China, with the claim that American markets are far more open to Chinese companies than the Chinese market to American companies. Third is intellectual property theft, and whether overtly through joint ventures and sharing of technologies, and those technologies then used independent of the joint venture, or outright theft through cyber. That's the third. And a fourth would be the subsidies of the Chinese government for favored industries, particularly those that are high technology and the technologies of the future. I mean, those are my categories. Is that a fair comment?
You know, investment restriction is going to be something that will be announced, I think. Also, there will be a revision of the Foreign Investment Act. And I think probably those are on the list of concern from the Chinese side.
Okay, Li Wei, let's go through some of the categories in terms of your observation. What will have to happen in that to transform this general agreement with very, some would say, woolly language or soft language into an agreement that will be robust and can be defended?
According to those four categories you just mentioned, we have actually achieved some progress. As for trade deficit, it is one issue that President Trump is very concerned. But due to the trade structure between the two countries and macroeconomic features of the two countries, it is impossible to eliminate all those trade imbalances between the two countries. But we have agreed to buy more to effectively reduce the trade deficits through increasing our imports from the United States. That issue might be resolved and might be improved. But again, I want to say that trade imbalances between the two countries are so complex and cannot be eliminated.
We heard this number of $200 billion a year, and those of us who know anything about economics, when we heard that number, were flabbergasted, because that is beyond any possibility, no one can come up with a legitimate scenario that I can think of that can even get to that number based upon the real structure.
You know, a lot of critics are, you know, bashing in Trump administration about not having specifics for lacking specific dollar amounts. So I think the $200 billion is not really something that both sides are seriously looking at. And the real solution, I think, that both sides are looking at are the possibilities of increase the Chinese import of American products.
Talk about market access and give me some very specific approaches to a structure that would satisfy you as in your position as chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in China.
Market access is both trade and investment, and to have reciprocal market access in general. U.S. market is open, Chinese market less open. And one area that we really need to focus on, the #1 challenge of U.S. businesses in China is an opaque, a non-transparent regulatory environment and inconsistent enforcement of rules and regulations. And going along with that is what we call window guidance.
What are the specific areas that you want to see changed that, if they were changed, would make you, as chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, pleased and can say to your members, this is a good deal for our companies?
The way that the regs have been written, now this is actually very transparent, and I have to applaud Chinese for Made in China 2025. It's been very transparent on what they want to do. But what happens is that new energy vehicle, whether it's battery or whether it's the entire car, are put at a big disadvantage by the rules and regulations. For instance, you've got an American car company, been here for years. Now, in order for them to continue selling any cars, they are required to manufacture, let's say, 20,000 new energy vehicles a year in several years. And now this really puts them at a disadvantage compared to companies here in China that have been focused entirely on new energy vehicles.
You look at market access as the primary concern of American industrialists. Bill represents them. What is your reaction, and what is good for China in terms of market access?
You know, if you look at the new energy vehicles, I think you know, the recent policy is going to be allowing, for example, wholly owned foreign investment in the new vehicle manufacturing. And the same is true with the production of a battery. And with regard to what Bill mentioned about in the past, I think, you know, this is going to be changed with the government effort to, for example, to streamline the government management, for example.
Are there specific categories of industries where China will continue to fight to have a differential protectionism?
As President Xi Jinping has expressed at the World Forum for Asia, China will massively open its market to the outside world. And he mentioned several sectors that we use to protect ourselves, such as automobile, shipbuilding, and airplane. And that might be several key sectors. We have some kind of domestic protection in the past, but in the future, I don't believe there will be any sectors still excluded to foreign enterprises.
So let's go on to the third category, which are intellectual, IP rights protection, and the concern of foreign companies that their technologies are expropriated in joint ventures or outright stolen through cyber theft. And if I scan the comments of politicians and experts in the U.S., that is the most emotional issue. Market access is important, but the emotional issue is this so-called very large number that's thrown around of the hundreds of billions of dollars of value per year that is lost through this so-called technology transfer, either illegal or certainly all immoral. So I want to address that. What will it take, Bill, for the U.S. and U.S. companies to say we feel satisfied that we have a plan going forward, and we all want to look forward, that will be robust enough to give us confidence to call off the trade war?
China has made great progress over the last 20 years in protecting intellectual property. But there's still a gap between the laws and the enforcement. And as we've seen in other countries, that until China has as much skin in the game as the U.S. companies in terms of developing their own intellectual property, it's going to, I think there will continue to be a gap. Now, one thing that I have heard from especially lawyers and folks that are involved with IP is that there has been great progress, copyrights, patents, trademarks.
But what specific steps can China take that will enhance the enforcement? Is it just on a case-by-case basis, or can some message go out that would give the American side confidence that this time is different? What can China do to make it clear that this time is different?
First of all, I think this government has already changed the government structure, the reform of the Patent Bureau, and that I think is going to give the Patent Bureau more power in terms of implementing future regulations and also the laws in terms of protecting IPs. Secondly, I think what Bill mentioned about is the trade secret. I think that has been taken into consideration in China's future efforts to protect the intellectual property, be it domestic or foreign. So going forward, I think the problem probably is going to be the kind of a consistency in terms of the national level law and the local level execution, and that requires, I think, a lot of training. And we don't really have, a kind of a uniform quality type of people at the local level in charge of the IP protection.
To be fair, there are these pilot programs in Shanghai, for example. They have an intellectual property court in which top judges are working, and hopefully that experience then can go out to the whole country. I mean, there are these pilot programs that are being quite. I visited one, and actually it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So let's go to the fourth category, which are government sponsors or subsidies through cheap loans or through grants to commercial companies in key technology areas. Li Wei, do you see any possibility that China will give that up? Because I do not.
I don't think China will give up its efforts to grow into more technology-based industries. But I think there might be some misconceptions and misinterpretation of China's intention of the Made in China 2025 plan. If China used to be a very good competitor in labor-intensive industries, such as toys, such as clothing, footwear, we are now in a kind of different development level, and we have the need to climb higher to the ladder of the global value chain, and we desire to make technology achievement and technological advancement. As for the subsidies, I think there might be some misinterpretation of the Made in China 2025. This is just a guiding principle, not instead of with the intent to exclude foreign companies.
But what can be done, given China's position, to try to level the playing field in those new technologies that China will continue to subsidize?
The Made in China 2025 and, frankly, other industry sectors really require innovation. China leadership understands in order for China to get out of the middle income trap that has trapped a number of developing countries in the past. It really needs innovation to drive the economy. Innovation is best stimulated through global cooperation, not through limiting development to just China or limiting data flows across border. Innovation really requires this, and I can see it's in China's interest to really not protect and limit the interaction while developing these innovations. The other thing is, which most other countries do in the world, rather than subsidies, and again I think this is in China's interest because so much money is wasted on subsidies. You have a subsidy in an industry sector, you get 400 companies entering the industry sector because they're getting the subsidy, they're not real players. Tax subsidy, or a tax credit rather, would really make infinite sense so that the real players, the real folks that are innovating and serious about the products in the industry sector will get involved, they'll develop, and they will get tax credits for their work.
You're not arguing against the concept of support, you're just arguing from the most efficient mechanism. Because in the U.S. we do tax credits when you want to drive R&D or various kinds of things. So not clear that there's a substantive, qualitative difference, although the techniques may be different. Leon, what is your view?
I think China attaches great importance in terms of future scenario of technological and scientific development. And obviously when designing the Made in China 2025, you know, this is really a kind of ambition that China has had, and basically the government, you know, is actually thinking of making it a part of the global system, leveraging international cooperation. What seems to be a blow to China recently is that if we really do that kind of thing, whether this kind of international cooperation is going to be like the case of ZTE, whether this is going to be cut off in the future in case of trade disputes or even for some other contingent differences, in which case China's national security can be compromised. So those are the considerations. But still, when China is talking about this program, Made in China 2025, China is still saying that it is not specifically designed to exclude foreign companies, by which they mean that foreign companies, if they wanted to really bring in their contributions to China, they are basically going to be treated fairly, equally.
But we're at a time period now where I think we have a ticking clock. And I would say that the ticking clock is, in one sense, in the American domestic scene, is the midterm elections. And I think that there'll be pressure on Trump and on the Republicans, certainly, to come up with some solution. Because if they don't have any solution by that time, that's going to be thrown against them very seriously. So I want to ask each of you three gentlemen, if you had to say right now what will be the key components of a deal that works, what would be it?
I think before the end of the year, there will be a success in reaching more consensus in the trade disputes.
Bill, what's your view? What is a deal going to look like that is going to satisfy the majority of American politicians and policy experts? and corporate leaders?
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, Robert. Yes, well, corporate leaders want to make sure they make money. So even though other parts of the economy are not doing well, they want to make sure their individual products are doing well. But looking at the country, because these midterm elections are coming up and because this is so important for Trump and I suppose also for the Republicans, that what I'm afraid of is that a deal that is acceptable to the American decision makers here is a deal on the deficit. The areas that are opening up, and we will find as we look at them, are really in China's interest. Opening up financial services is definitely in China's interest.
Leong, give me your sense.
Yeah, that's my concern as well.
Of the kind of thing that you think would be sufficient in specifics in the categories of market access or IPR protection to satisfy at least the mainstream American interests.
First of all, I would say, something that President Donald Trump prefers to have is that by the time, or even starting from now, is something in his hand that he can wave to his constituencies that here's what I get. Here's the exports that I've made to China, which includes farm products, energy products. But on top of that, I think the other thing he could possibly waive is the tariff reduction.
No trade war, at least for now, is certainly a good thing. It is to the credit of China and the U.S. to step back from the brink, but let no one underestimate the challenges ahead. On the internally fractured U.S. side, just because the joint statement did not itemize actions, it did not specify market access or intellectual property protection in particular, some lament that China is winning Trump's trade war. Others call it a temporary respite in hostilities. Here's my fear. While I have argued that most American experts are not motivated to impede China's rise, as many in China believe, I can no longer make that argument full-throated. In the U.S., there has been a dark turn in surmising that U.S. policy towards China, calibrated over 4 decades to shepherd China's peaceful rise, has failed. China, U.S. experts have come to believe, has become a competitor and may become an adversary, and that U.S. relations with China must now be managed as with an emergent adversary, not as with a developing partner. In China, nationalistic voices are louder, castigating the U.S. for its self-serving motivation to impede China's rise, and calling for China to become more self-reliant more rapidly, especially in world-class semiconductors, so that the country would not be vulnerable to U.S. blackmail. Welcome to the unhappy world of self-fulfilling prophecy, where the actions of each side in response to a perceived threat from the other side increases the likelihood of that threat becoming real. To both sides, I say this: contemplate why the other side is misinterpreting your actions. To my American friends, what makes China think the U.S. is resisting its rise? To my Chinese friends, what makes the U.S. think that China is a competitor and may become an adversary? Projecting malevolent motives and seeing sinister conspiracies is the easy way out. It can solicit cheers in one's domestic media, but it impedes progress. The U.S. and China must each figure out how not to confirm the other's self-fulfilling prophecy. I hope that's happening, but deep issues remain. The U.S. said it would be ready to levy tariffs if China did not live up to its commitments. The next round of negotiations in Beijing will be telling. We'll be there to be closer to China.